In our last part, we looked at a brief history of YouTube poops and some of the influences it had on today's remix culture. To watch that video, there is a link in the description. The question I am about to present you and ask you may come off as a comedic gesture, but I assure you that this is something you should still take seriously. I'm not the only one to ask this question, but I'm going to narrow it down. Are YouTube poops Dadaist art? Now, I won't go into the semantics of what makes fine art considered fine art, because that's just merely left up to the ambiguous whole that is subjectivity. I will be merely basing this video off the arguments based on the criteria that makes Dadaist art. But before I can even get into toying with that idea, I'm going to have to teach most of you what Dada art and the movement is and was. Instead of giving you the Wikipedia definition, I'm going to give you my own definition that might make it simpler. The Dada art movement was preemptively a postmodern idea, where artists rejected logic and aestheticism of the Western world by expressing irrational and nonsense in artwork. Although this was mostly a reaction to World War I and II, as most postmodernism is at its core a reaction to anyway, it still has its grips in modern art as well. Later in the movement, it was apparent that Dada was more resembling surrealist art, but in reality it was a prototype for postmodern art in general. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, what does this have to do with YouTube poops? Well, almost everything. If we look at the history of YouTube poops and the Dada art movement, they kind of have a similar pattern. I believe that YouTube poops are inherently a reaction to what is going on back then on YouTube with vloggers making their way to the top. The internet has always had its niche underground communities, and even though the reaction to them may not seem like the main motive, it certainly had a part, just like the Dada movement and the reaction to capitalism and the world wars. However, the craft of both YTPs and Dada are very similar, and I don't really have to explain this. Even though a YouTube poop can tell a story or have some kind of message, it usually doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. But we'll get into that later. YTPs are inherently anarchistic in nature just by being nonsensical and irrational. But let's look at it from this perspective as well. Hans Richter once said, "Dada is not art, it is anti-art." Applying this logic to YouTube poops, you start to see a line form. A YouTube poop takes the original source and destroys any prior meaning it had by manipulating it in ways that may be unwelcomed. Dada art rejected the aesthetic nature of its art and its craft. YTPs don't really have a measure of quality. It's almost impossible to judge it by its craft entirely. Yeah, this video can have bad editing, but at the same time, that just might be an intentional style choice. YTPs just give a perfunctory nod to the craft of itself and revels in its chaotic matrix, which is also how we kinda look at music as well, especially in the lo-fi genre. There's a line that can be crossed between craft and artistic intent. Another argument for YTPs being Dadaist art is just how self-referential it can be. A lot of Dadaist art has its name in some of the pieces itself. For YouTube poops, a lot of YTPs have a distinct self-awareness to them, and often reference themselves. YouTube poops kind of indulge in their own culture as well. Now, when looking at the humor of YouTube poops, we can deconstruct that the absurd nature of the joke that is funny is not the joke itself. I think this also coincides with Dada and its artistic motive of denying logic forthright. Now let's look at what led after Dadaism and YouTube poops. Dadaism influenced surrealism, pop art, and punk rock. With YouTube poops, they inspired montage parodies and a lot of nonsensical ironic humor that we see in a lot of short edits like Vines. The natural evolution of both of these seem to mirror themselves in some way. However, let's look on the other side of the coin here. There's a few things that may contest this idea. If we were to base this argument solely off earlier YouTube poops and their lack of overall narrative, I'd say yes and not even continue with this video. However, if you watch the 2 videos before this in the series, you will know that this isn't the case. I've talked about the evolution of YTPs, but haven't delved too deep into it. With poopers like Orpheus FTW, Deeper Cut, and Durham Rocker Z coming onto the scene with somewhat narrative-driven YouTube poops, the dynamic of the genre changed. Let's look at Durham Rocker Z, King of the Hill YouTube poops. These YouTube poops are almost weird remixes of the original source material, as they just strictly go with the linear plot of the episode, just, with YouTube poop added in. When adding this narrative aspect to it all, it doesn't really work with the idea of Dada art. Assigning purpose and any type of conciseness, especially by adding a narrative, to Dadaism doesn't make it Dadaism. Of course, I don't dictate what Dadaism is, and nobody can really dictate what YTPs are either. When talking about what defines fine art, I don't think the public perception would even consider this art, even today's modern sensibilities and its influence on remix culture. In fact, I think YouTube poops now fall in more within the meme spectrum. I'll be brushing my teeth hard after saying that one. Well, that's just both sides of the argument. In my personal opinion though, I really feel that YouTube poops are art in the Dadaist and Surrealist way, but I can understand why a lot of people might not see it that way. It seems that a lot of YouTube poopers themselves, especially ones that I've talked to, say they really don't consider it art. With a perspective like that, this is the kind of thing that makes it really hard to pinpoint. With that, I think this YouTube poop retrospective series is done for now. I will return to it with a part 4 eventually, but for now I feel like I need to focus on other types of content. So, thank you guys for watching, and make sure to watch all the other parts. Also, YouTube poops still have a very strong ongoing community. I'm sure we're going to see a revival in the works eventually. Let's just welcome it when it comes.